We're going to have a look at this subject this afternoon. We are going to look at Russia and Europe, but I really want to emphasise this principle that comes from Luke 21, from the Olivet prophecy about lifting up your heads when you begin to see these things come to pass. So let's go to Luke 21, because this is what we really want to focus in on just for a moment. Because hopefully you can see your Bibles okay. I've got those lights off because we do have a lot of information on the screen, mainly to do with current events and some charts and things. So let's go to Luke 21 though and have a look. We're very familiar with these words, but we want to, I suppose, delve a little bit deeper in this session on some of the scriptures that Jesus was alluding to in Luke 21 when he gives this exhortation about the last days, and it particularly is to do with Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel, and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. I know these are well familiar words, but let's focus in on them anyway. Luke 21 verse 24. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword. That's the context of the Jewish nation going into captivity in AD 70. And they shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down. Now, my Bible has a reference in the little reference there in the margin to Daniel chapter 8. Trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles fulfilled. Until. And that reference is absolutely spot on. It's a reference to Daniel chapter 8. The fact that there was a wonderful prophet Daniel who desired to know more, who listened in to the conversation of two angels that were talking, saying, how long will it be? How long will it be from the events in Daniel chapter 8, which was to do with a battle between the Medes and Persians and the Greeks in 333? And the question was, how long is that vision going to be until the sanctuary that is no longer trodden down? 2,300 days was the answer, and that brings you to 1967. Trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So there's going to be a time, which was in 1967, when the Jewish people would retake that city of Jerusalem. Now, there's just no disputing that at all. And I've said to my children, even in more recent times with the events happening in Israel, that if you can have a good, thorough understanding of what these prophecies to do with Israel speak about, your faith will be so much stronger and will be unshakable, because there's no doubting at all these words. They're not ambiguous, they're clear. The time would come when the Jewish people would retake the city of Jerusalem. And then what happens? Verse 25. There shall be signs in the sun and the moon and in the stars, and upon earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. Now that's, while there may be a literal application of that, I think there's a reference back particularly there to the prophet Joel. And I really believe that so much of the Olivet prophecy, including the way the Olivet prophecy is structured, is based on the book of Joel, because the subject's the same, the symbology is the same, sun, moon and stars. That's exactly what you've got at the end of Joel chapter 2 and the beginning of Joel chapter 3. We'll mention Joel briefly a little bit later, God willing. So in other words, there's going to be incredible political signs in Israel and in the nations, in the politics of the world. There'll be perplexity. It means there's just going to be no way out. People are going to see no way out. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. That's talking about the events that are happening in our world today, that are rocking our world at its foundations. And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Where's Jesus described as Son of Man? It's Daniel chapter 7. Jesus went to heaven with the angels, one like the Son of Man, and he's coming again. Verse 28, and this is where the theme of our study this afternoon comes from. Verse 28. I specifically chose this theme for this afternoon because it's so important. When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. Now, what is that telling us? And then, of course, it goes on to the parable of the fig tree to do with the return of the Jewish people to their nation. It's telling us, brothers and sisters, that many at the time that Christ is about to be revealed into the earth will be looking down. They'll be down. They won't be looking up. In other words, they need encouragement. I always think of this verse sort of as more of a literal thing. I'm sitting on that train coming home. I commute to Sydney a couple of days a week. I go past the train stations. You see a few hundred people on the train station. They're all, every single one of them, their heads looking down on their phones. But I think here it's talking about the fact that people are not, or even the brotherhood potentially as well, they're not looking forward. No, they're not looking at the kingdom. Their heads down in whatever else is going on. Or we're disenchanted, or we're struggling with whatever's happening in our lives, and our heads are down. And he's saying here, lift up your heads because your redemption draws nigh when you see these things come to pass. And then there's this wonderful prophecy of the fig tree, of course. I think also Matthew 24 gives the answer very much as to how people's heads up. How do we lift our heads up? It talks about coming to the household with meat in due season. There's a reference back to the days of Elijah, I believe, when Elijah was depressed under that juniper tree, and the angel comes and feeds him meat in due season. Matthew 24 record says we need to build one another up in the scriptures in the last day. That helps us to lift up our heads. Elijah needed his head to be lifted up. But here's the warning in verse 34. Again, they're so familiar, these words, that we can sometimes sort of just hear them and rattle them off without thinking what it's all about. It says, take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts, that means not just what we say, but deep down in our hearts, be overcharged with surfeiting, which means partying and overindulging, and drunkenness, and the cares of this life, so that day come upon you unawares. You might think, well, we may not be partying, may not be getting drunk, but the cares of this life, that is and I'm sure it's not just me that has that problem, that the cares of this life can burden you down, whatever it might be, all the different things that this life, just the basic things of life can be. It can make us in a situation where we're just looking down at the ground and we're not focusing on what is real. And the real thing is that Christ is coming to set up the kingdom. And he's saying, lift up your heads, lest that day come upon you unawares. And the other the reference in Matthew says that when it's going to be like the days of Noah, so that when Jesus comes back, and he actually comes back, there will be believers who will actually say, I didn't know you were coming. I didn't realise you were coming. And it says that in the days of Noah, they knew not that the flood came. In other words, they said, we didn't know the flood was coming. And yet Noah was preaching it for 120 years that it was coming. And when it came, they said, I didn't know it was coming. So this is the danger for us. We can be burdened down with the cares of this life so that we don't focus on what's happening, what the reality is, and that's Christ is coming. For as a snare it shall come on them that dwell on the face of the earth. Has that ever happened in biblical history? Can you think of any events where there was partying and drunkenness and destruction came on them unawares? It has to be Daniel, doesn't it? Daniel chapter 5, that's exactly, and in fact it says for as a trap, as a snare. That's exactly the destruction of Babylon is described like that in the book of Isaiah. It came on them like a trap. And there's a party going on in Babylon. Daniel chapter 5 is the story of our world. People completely unaware that the army is around the city. And the answer then is verse 36. Watch ye therefore and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all those things that shall come to pass and stand before the Son of Man. Daniel chapter 7, Son of Man. So, and there's so many other scriptures where Jesus alludes to the book of Daniel in relation to the final hours and days of his ministry. And it's telling us to be alert, be watchful. Jesus said to his disciples, watch, can you not watch with me 1 hour? And he's talking about that you pray that you enter not into temptation and to escape those things. So I always find these words of Jesus so powerful here, where he says to his disciples, "Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see and did not see it, and to hear what you hear and not hear it." And he's talking to his disciples about events that were occurring in his day. How much more can that relate to our days? And particularly when you look at events happening in the world, they've talked for decades about the potential of an Israeli strike or a US strike on Iran on their nuclear facilities. I remember back in the late 1990s they were talking about this. And whenever it's been mentioned by very, the hawk politicians in America, every now and again they mention about maybe bombing Iran. They're like, hang on, you can't even talk about it. Don't even think about it. Don't mention that. Are you serious? And yet here we are today where the unthinkable has actually happened. And that not only did Israel bomb Iran, but the United States came to severely cripple Iran's power of their nuclear power. And it's put Israel in a situation when you read the news, you read the comments coming out of Israel about how that Israel are incredibly strong, and I really believe that's correct, the way that Des was presenting that today on Ezekiel 38. They have this confidence in themselves. And not only that, they've got this ally in America who had to be led by Israel to get to that point, and their enemies, one by one, are being decimated. They're in a situation where they're unaware that there's another enemy coming from afar, from further afar. They're totally unaware, and that's what we're going to have a look at here today, God willing. But let's just stop for a minute before we go on to that. What are the benefits of Bible prophecy? Why do we really want to look at prophecy? Because I totally agree with what Des said, where he said it's not about predicting for events in the future. It's about identifying these things when we see them. But it's also to give us encouragement and strength and so much more. Let's have a look. This is my best summary, I suppose, I could come up with. Seeing life in perspective with God's plan. Isn't that like one of the hardest things? Being confident in God's word, to be moved to action. It gives us a vision of the future because it helps us to connect everything. It all connects well when we can understand it. We learn how God thinks, and a lot of the prophecies, particularly about the apostasy in the book of Revelation, is like that. It helps us to be clear. We can see clearly what's going on, and we learn how God thinks about false religion and corruption in the world. Our relationship with Israel and the Jewish people. When we understand prophecy, it helps us to have a closer relationship with God's hope of Israel and with the Jews who are about to be received, not to their knowledge yet, but when their Messiah actually comes into the earth. But I think more importantly, and probably, or just as importantly, is encouragement and comfort to hold on to the end. Doesn't matter what age you lived in, there was always prophecies being fulfilled that gave you encouragement. It gave you comfort. And that's why I believe there are so many scriptures that speak of prophecies being fulfilled in the final days, the final hours, and the final minutes of the life of Jesus Christ. Why is that? Because he needed help, he needed encouragement, he needed strength. That God was with him and these things were being fulfilled. Not that Jesus didn't already know that, but it gave him incredible comfort and encouragement to hold on through what he had to go through. Now this is where we're at in our world. And we're starting to see, we're living in a world where this reference constantly seems to be made now to World War III. It's almost like, well, we all know that there's a real risk of this actually happening. Here's one little example of this, and I've got a few little video clips throughout this talk to make it a bit more interesting. Here's one.
A short time ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin was asked if he is worried that the world could be heading toward World War III in this situation. Here's what he said.
Говорю без всякой иронии.
It is disturbing. I'm speaking without any irony, without any jokes. Of course, there is a lot of conflict potential. It is growing, and it is right under our noses, and it affects us directly. And this requires, of course, not only our careful attention to the events taking place, but also the search for solutions. The search for solutions, preferably by peaceful means.
Short time ago.
Okay, so there we go. And here's a comment which at the beginning of last year made by the foreign editor of the Weekend Australian, Greg Sheridan, who said that the world stands on the brink of security collapse and perhaps widely extended war. Iran has moved its proxies directly into killing American soldiers in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Russia is starting to prevail in Ukraine. Russia, meanwhile, with 2 military bases in Syria, now looks set to establish a nuclear submarine base in Tobruk in Libya. So this is what we're seeing in our world. Headlines like this, again in the Australian by a different writer in September of last year, who says that the prospect of all-out war, world war, is now very real. And this is not a sensationalist news source at all. It's a pretty conservative news source, the Australian, and he's saying there that we need to understand how dangerous the current situation is. And referring to an academic, well-known academic writer who said that World War III is becoming more likely in the near term and the US is too weak to either prevent it or, should war come, be confident of victory. He warned that a global slide towards war is a distinct possibility. We in the West need to shake ourselves out of an entrenched sense of indifference to this prospect. Now, does that match up with what Des is talking about Israel's focus in Ezekiel 38? It certainly matches up with what we're reading in Luke 21 and Matthew 24 about the state of the world and our potential way of thinking at the time of Christ's return. An entrenched sense of indifference to this prospect. This is the world in which we live. Now, just something on Luke 21. Let's just have a look at, and we're going to go back to Daniel in a minute because I believe this is where Jesus is referring to. Luke 21, we've read that already. Notice the words there, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. That's the wording of Daniel chapter 8. Until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now in Matthew 24, there's this reference here that says, when Jesus says to his disciples, when they're saying, look how amazing the stones of the temple are. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. Not shall be thrown down. And again, he says in chapter 24, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand that let him which is in Judea flee to the mountains. So there's these references all the time back to Daniel 7, Daniel 8, that the holy place and the truth will be thrown down and trodden underfoot. Now the wording of Daniel chapter 8, we will actually go to Daniel chapter 8. Let's actually go there. I know I've got the words on the screen. I really want us to be having a look at our Bibles. Now I understand I'm going to be having a little look at Daniel 7 and 8 now in relation to Russia and Europe. We're going to be very big picture, but we're also going to focus on some key points of interpretation in these two chapters. Daniel chapter 8, verse 11 to 12, therefore, speaks there, the wording on the screen I've got with the highlighted words there, speaks of the Roman power in the Middle East, where it says he magnified himself even to the prince of the hosts, that's Jesus, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away and the place of his sanctuary cast down, speaking about the temple and the Temple Mount. A host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground. You see what Jesus is referring to? He says that happens until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And Jesus comes out of the Garden of Gethsemane at his time of greatest trial, and he comes before this man, Caiaphas. You can go to that place today in Israel, right where these words were spoken. And Caiaphas simply says to him, tell me whether you're the Christ, the Son of God. And I believe Jesus he must have his mind filled with the book of Daniel because he keeps quoting Daniel. And Jesus simply says to him, you have said correctly. But nevertheless, you're going to see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. He's quoting Daniel 7 and he's quoting Psalm 110. And why do you think Jesus was quoting Daniel 7? If he's thinking about Daniel 7, if he's thinking about Psalm 110, he's just been in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's talked about this with the angel. Is it possible the angel was giving him encouragement? Is it possible that those words of Daniel were what were giving Jesus encouragement? The fact that he was going to be taken to be with his Father in heaven as the Son of Man would come to the Ancient of Days, but that he would become King of the world and come to save those who were faithful. And Caiaphas says, tell us whether you're the Son of God. He says, I am the Son of God, but don't you worry about that. You're going to see the Son of Man coming. I'm the one. The high priest, a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110. And here he is in front of this corrupt priest. He is the priest who's coming not just as priest, he's coming as king. You see, Jesus is always thinking about the book of Daniel. Here's one other one as an example. You could do a whole series of studies on these. He goes then before Pilate on the same day. He goes before Pilate and he's standing before Pilate, the very subject of the prophecy of Daniel, chapter 8, the Roman power in the Middle East. And Pilate says, don't you know who you're talking to? I've got the power to crucify you and the power to release you. And Jesus, because he understood the power of Bible prophecy in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 8, he just simply said, you could have no power against me unless it was given you from above. Because Daniel chapter 8, talking about the Greeks and the Romans, it actually says at the end of verse 22, if you've got chapter 8 open, it says, now that being broken, Alexander the Great, where 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms will stand up out of this nation, but not in his power. Not in his power. And it's talking about the development of the Romans out of the Greeks. And it's also, the God of heaven has given you a kingdom. Remember Daniel's words to Nebuchadnezzar? That's what Daniel's all about. It's that the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. They have no power at all unless it is given you from above. That's the power of Bible prophecy. Jesus was speaking it in his final minutes and hours of his life. And this is the well-known prophecy to us that we know about from Daniel chapter 7. The fact that Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 fit like a glove. Daniel 2 to Daniel 7 is written in the Chaldean language, which is from Daniel 2 verse 4 to the end of Daniel chapter 7 is a different language. It's not in Hebrew because it's like the kingdom of men. And you've got Daniel 2 and you've got Daniel 7 there like brackets to the amazing, crazy things that go on in the kingdom of men. And Daniel 3, 4, 5 and 6 speak about all the crazy things that happen in the kingdom of men. But you notice the unique presentation that's made of these prophecies in Daniel that are quite unique to the rest of the scripture, except maybe the book of Revelation. They're described as first, second, third and fourth. Now, we've got the same type of presentation in the book of Revelation where we have a continuous historic interpretation of prophecy. The first kingdom of Babylon is first, then after this is a second. Then there's the Greeks, then there's the Romans, and then Christ comes. So we've got a clear point of interpretation here that it's the Roman beast that exists when Christ returns. Russia and Europe and its allies will be destroyed by Christ when Christ comes, when they come down onto the mountains of Israel. And you've got that parallel there given, or a contrast between men and beasts in Psalm 49 there, which is what Daniel's referring to. The fact that the kingdom of men is here from a man's perspective, Daniel chapter 2, from God's perspective, Daniel chapter 7, where you've got wild beasts. And the fourth kingdom is the one we're particularly interested in from a prophetic point of view. And that is that the Roman power continues till Christ returns, not just in the church, but also in the political and the military system. It occurs in the latter days, so we expect to see the Roman power in the latter days, significant. The stone strikes the feet, so it's the iron in the feet. And they're all broken together. So there's an impact of all those empires, latter-day representations of all of those empires, which is what we read of also in Ezekiel 38, are there at the time of God's judgments in the earth. And there's the Roman Empire there, which is the fourth kingdom, which will be destroyed when Christ comes. And that was broken into two. There's an east and a west, with the west centred in Rome and the east centred in Constantinople. And we would therefore expect some re-emergence of that in the last days at the time of the Battle of Armageddon. Now in Daniel chapter 7, and we don't want to jump around too much, but we want to really focus here on Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. And while most of you would be familiar with those prophecies, what I want to do here now is pull out some key points of interpretation to really show us what, when we see the events happening today, we can see exactly that that's what Daniel is talking about. Daniel chapter 7 describes the fourth beast. It's the kingdom of Rome, which is destroyed when Christ comes. It's clear from Daniel 7 that that's the empire that's destroyed. Notice here the key points here of interpretation in Daniel 7. It says 10 horns out of this kingdom, out of Rome, are 10 kings that shall arise. In other words, they're European kings. And another shall rise after them. So once the Roman Empire breaks up in the late 300s and 400s AD, then another kingdom will arise after the breakup of the Roman Empire. We'll see what that is in a minute. And it's the little horn power. He shall speak great words against the Most High and shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And this is why Daniel was so sick and shaken by this vision, because he could see the terrible impact that this Roman system would have upon the truth, on true believers. And we're not going to deal really with the role of the papacy and the Catholic Church quite so much today, but we need to remember that the Church, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, are totally and completely involved with everything that the political and the military system does of Russia and Europe. The little horn, what is this little horn? Well, when you just look at the text, in the text itself, it becomes clear who it is. It comes after the breakup of the Roman Empire, and it comes from within the Roman Empire. Think of these points. It speaks blasphemy against God. So it's a religious power. It's a military power because it subdues 3 other powers and makes war. It's a political power because it changes times and laws. And it's a persecuting power because it kills the saints. What system with a blaspheming mouth and eyes that sees everything arose after the breakup of the Roman Empire? Well, it's the political dominion of the papacy, of the Catholic Church, which was the Holy Roman Empire. There it is, Holy Roman Empire. You know, today we have another version of the Holy Roman Empire today. And there's plenty of magazines and news articles that have paralleled and linked the modern European Union with the historic Holy Roman Empire from 800 AD. There it is. A little horn with a mouth, a blaspheming mouth of the papacy, and the holy see, the eyes that see all things through the work of their priesthood through the Dark Ages. Now, what is really interesting about that system is also in existence when Christ comes. Now, let's have a look at this. Let's have a look. Let's go to Daniel 7. Again, we want to look at what the text says about this. It says, verse 11 of Daniel 7 tells us that the beast is there until the end. So the beast is destroyed. That's the wider Roman Empire and given to the burning flame. That's verse 11 of chapter 7. But verse 18 says, the saints of the Most High will take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever. And verse 21 then says, I beheld the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them through the dark ages until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. So we expect to see the little horn power, the political dominion of the papacy in the earth when Christ comes. Do we see that today? We absolutely see that today. And I remember the last time I did a talk in this place was in February 2020. It just happened to be on the exact morning that Brexit came into being in February. I think it was the 1st of February 2020, when Britain broke free of that Holy Roman Empire. And there was all sorts of language used in the press on that day about a divorce from Catholic Europe, and the biggest event since the Reformation, where Britain broke free of that system. And those of you who were there at that, remember that weekend when we considered these prophecies, will never forget the power of seeing in our days what brothers and sisters had talked about for many decades, that Britain would break out of that system. And there it is, it's going to be in existence when Christ comes. But look also at verse 26. Because 26 of Daniel 7 says, judgment will sit, and they, that's the saints, will take away his dominion and consume and destroy it unto the end. So the dominion must be there for Christ and the saints to take it away. So we can expect to see the Holy Roman Empire. It might be included some other countries like Spain, Portugal, for instance, maybe a few others, but generally, it's that power of Western Europe, headed by the papacy, with the Catholic Church having a very strong control of the military and political system of Europe, will be there when Christ comes. Now, that is a fascinating picture. If you want to know more about that, just do a Google search of, I think it's Vatican Snake Room. That's a picture of the Assembly Hall within Vatican City. And it doesn't matter which way you look at it, there's even an overhead picture as well you can see, which it also looks like a snake. It looks like a serpent, whether you look at it from that way or from that way. It's absolutely incredible. That is the little horn of Daniel's fourth beast. It's the serpent power that has waged war on the saints for hundreds of years through the ages. But there's just one other thing before we look at Daniel chapter 8 that I just want to mention, which is also just a very little statement made in Daniel 7 that we can gloss over. And it's in verse 7 and it's also in verse 19. And that is, in verse 7, at the end of that verse, it says that the beast stamped the residue with the feet of it. And verse 19 says that he wanted to know the truth of the fourth beast, and it says at the end of verse 19, he devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue. Now, the residue means what's left over. I know when we do, say, road widening, in my job we do road widening, and we buy some land to do some road widening, and we take a little strip out the front of someone's house, we have to move their fence. The rest of what's left behind is the residue, it's the rest. And hopefully you don't take too much, you just take a little strip and you then refer to the residue is the rest of the 90% that's left behind, and you rebuild the fence and then you've got the residue. This is what the residue is. It's that area which the Roman Empire did not occupy. In the past, the Roman Empire did not occupy that area of Syria, Iraq and Iran, and possibly part of Afghanistan there as well, and maybe a bit of Pakistan. The residue didn't have Rome in that territory. And we're starting to see, I believe, signs today, particularly after the bombing of Iran, where Russia's influence in Iran is going to become more stronger. And we're going to see Iran reaching out to Russia, and we're going to see Syria reaching out to Russia. And I was amazed when I looked at the news very late last night. I saw that the Syrian government has actually called on Russia, officially called on Russia for help militarily and for a partnership. And there was a lot of doubt about this when there was a coup in Syria as to what Russia's future was. And Russia moved a lot of its military equipment and naval equipment to North Africa. But it's become clear in the last 24 hours that Russia is going to be very much in that territory around Syria, which means their potential to impact Iraq and Iran is going to be strong. And we're going to see the fourth beast tread in that area. It doesn't mean they necessarily have to take it all over necessarily. The first step of this was about 5 or 6 years ago when Iran, for the first time, allowed Russian military aircraft to actually land in Iran and use its airstrips. That was 5, 6 or 7 years ago. And it was just the start of Russia's influence in Iran, of treading the residue, stamping that residue. In other words, the Roman Empire will stretch and will include Iran and Iraq. That's why Ezekiel 38, you've got the reference to Persia. And what does it say about Gog's role with Persia? It just says one little statement. Be thou a guard unto them. Little statement that means a lot. Be a protector for them. That's exactly what Syria has asked for last night for Russia. That's what Iran is currently asking for from Russia. Be a guard, be a protector for us. Because Trump's come in and smashed our nuclear facilities, Israel have decimated us. We need a protector. Now, just on Daniel chapter 8, and let's keep this high as possible, because you might think, oh no, that was heavy enough. What about Daniel 8's another story again? Well, to keep it simple, Daniel 8 just gives extra details that Daniel 7 doesn't give. It gives extra details to what chapter 2 doesn't give. And it's that picture, which is quite an old picture, which some of you would have in a Bible insert in your Bibles, shows the transfer of power from kingdom number 2 to kingdom number 3. We know that's the Medes and the Persians. The power transferred to kingdom number 3, which is the Greeks. And the notable horn there is Alexander the Great, and that when Alexander the Great died, there were 4 more horns came up, which were his generals. And that's the basic picture of Daniel chapter 8, that it's a vision of giving more detail, but more focusing on the events in the Middle East. And I'm not sure if you realise, but, and no doubt you've heard speakers talk about this before, is the fact that Daniel 7 mainly focuses on Western Europe. It does talk about the whole Roman Empire, but there's a main focus on the little horn on Western Europe. But when you come to Daniel chapter 8, it also talks about the whole Roman Empire, but Daniel 8 focuses more on the Middle East. And that's why when Jesus looks at Pilate and Pilate says, don't you know that I've got the power? Jesus says, you have no power except to be given you from above. He quotes Daniel 8 because Daniel 8 is the chapter that talks about Rome in the Middle East. And you think, well, hang on, how does Medes and Persians and how does the Greeks, how does that impact the Middle East? Well, this is how it impacts it. And let's do this by pictures rather than having to go through the text in detail. Alexander the Great's empire was roughly that. Just a picture out of a history book. It's the third out of 4 kingdoms in Daniel chapter 2, 7, 8. It broke up into 4. Remember how the notable horn on the goat broke up into 4, and there was 4 generals. So when Alexander died after 13 years of and conquering, he died at 33, and his generals ended up. And 2 of those generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, their territories became the more dominant territories, which eventually became the king of the north and the south, and that's explained more in Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11, king of the north, king of the south, is more of an explanation of what's mentioned in chapter 8, and that is that 2 of the generals became dominant, became king of the north and king of the south, and there it is there. And it's interesting that today, the king of the north and king of the south is generally, or we say those general territories are taken up by predominantly in the north, you've got more Shiite Muslim population, whereas in the south, you've got more predominantly Sunni Muslim population, and that Russia's role is not just going to be in the northern area, but they're also going to infiltrate into Africa, and we're going to look at that in just a tick. even though that many of this southern area are Sunni Muslims, there's going to be an alliance with Saudi Arabia, Great Britain around and to the south of Israel, but Russia will also move into North Africa. So, Daniel 8, we've pretty well described all of that already. Pretty well talked about that. That's just a summary. It continues till it's destroyed by the Prince of Princes and it is broken by divine intervention. And what we didn't mention was, and we'll come to that, it was verse 23 to 25. And here's a very basic depiction of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. You've got a little horn in the west and a little horn in the east. And they work independently, but eventually they come to agreements, and they've done that through history, where you have a religious centre in the west and you have a military centre in the east. And Daniel chapter 8, the words on the screen says, "The latter time of the Greek kingdom, there will become a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences. Stand up." This is Rome. "And not by his own power." There's Pilate in the Middle East. "Not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully, prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people." That's Rome. "And through his policy he shall also cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he shall destroy many. And he shall stand up against the Prince of Princes, but he shall be broken without hand," or without human help. In other words, not only would Christ be put to death by Rome, but Rome would be in existence when Christ comes and would be destroyed by Christ when he comes. Rotherham says, "By their careless security will he destroy many. He will destroy many in their prosperity," says the New King James Version. That's exactly what is going to happen at Armageddon, when Russia, with her allies, comes down onto the mountains of Israel. By their careless security, he will destroy many. Rome will be in existence at the time of the end. Not just religious Rome, but the military capital of Rome in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And you can look at the differences between the West and the East. Pretty well spoken about this already. The West is mainly religious, but it also has a military power. The East is mainly a military power, but it also has a religious power. The mouthpiece in the West is the papacy. The military centre acknowledges the papacy, just like today, where the Russian leader acknowledges the papacy, and they work in together. They're working at an alliance. They're both hostile to the truth. They're both finally destroyed by Christ, and Daniel was grieved by these things. That's the link between Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Now, how does that relate to the time of the end? Well, we've seen the Eastern and Western churches working together to come together. So many more pictures we could put up showing the priests, the heads of the churches as well, both East and West, coming together. And we remain to be seen how this works with the new Pope. He's already reached out to Vladimir Putin already, particularly focused on potential peace agreement in Ukraine. Daniel chapter 11 uses all the same language as well. We won't actually go into Daniel chapter 11, but it just, all the same words, is the power of Rome, and today it's Russia, aligned with Europe. They'll magnify themselves above everything else. In other words, they make themselves the subject of worship, which is then, in the language of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, picked up, just brilliantly picked up there. See, it talks about the man of sin opposing and exalting himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped. He sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he's God. In other words, there's this religious power that came out of the first century ecclesia actually makes themselves the subject of worship. So in our days, we've seen this develop. This is what we've seen develop. The king of the north and the king of the south. And that is exactly what we're seeing today happen. Now, Egypt, you could say, pretty well has already seen Britain in Egypt. Egypt is starting to feel the impact of Russia's move very slowly and very surely south. But Russia's influence is becoming strong in that northern crescent just there. Now, Let's have a look at this, because I know that's a Christadelphian chart. We're going to see in a minute there's a political leader actually created virtually the same chart. But I do want to mention something which is also fascinating, and I suppose it's a little bit of an aside, but it is important. And is that just as we've got two phases of judgment in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, Western and Eastern, so too we've got these described as the wheat harvest and the grape harvest. Joel chapter 3, for instance, says, "Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe." Then what's the next words? "Go get you down, for the vats overflow." We've heard those words for years, haven't we? Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. The first phase of judgment. Go get ye down, for the press is full, the vats overflow. And the two phases of judgment when Christ comes is firstly the Battle of Armageddon in the land of Israel. Secondly, that's the wheat harvest. Secondly, the grape harvest, which is the rebellion in Europe. So the Daniel chapter 8 of Russia becoming the Roman power in the Middle East once again, that's the wheat harvest. The grape harvest is the rebellion in Europe, which is Revelation 17, that talks about the press being full and the vat. It's the vats, it's the wine. And fascinating that the eastern part of the empire today is the main wheat growing area of the world, yet the Western European continent is the main grape growing, just by chance. How about that? But it's also the two stages of the deliverance of Israel. That first stage, Armageddon, the wheat harvest, is when Christ comes to save the tents of Judah first. And it's the second phase, which is the grape harvest, which is the second phase of God's judgment. And not just God's judgment, but the deliverance of Israel. So the deliverance of Israel matches exactly the judgment on the world. You've got the judgment on the world of wheat harvest, grape harvest. You've got this deliverance of Israel of Armageddon, the Jews in the land responding to Jesus, and then you've got Elijah in the second Exodus recovering Jews outside the land. That's during the period of the grape harvest. It's fascinating, isn't it? Daniel 7, Daniel 8, wheat, grapes, restoration of the Jews in the land, out of the land. It all matches, it just matches hand in glove, absolutely perfect. So today, this is what we're starting to see happen. A couple of years ago, just before the October attacks, we had Mr. Netanyahu saying that there was going to be a peace deal between the Saudis and the Israelis, and he had a picture up there showing what we could, well, not quite, but almost what we would call King of the South, hoping that this was all going to happen. Of course, the October 7 attacks occurred, and everything changed. He found himself back in the United Nations with that picture. Now, does that look familiar to you? I know it's slightly different because you've got Sudan in the southern kingdom there, but he's got virtually a map from a Christadelphian lecture or Bible talk in his hands. King of the North, King of the South. Now, of course, Sudan, which is part of the green there on the section which he calls a blessing, we will see fall into Russia's hands, and that's actually happening with Russia moving in there with its ships at the moment. But we're going to see this latter-day Roman power come into the Middle East for some reason. And it does seem that the world is now, every day, you're reading it no doubt in news, or you're hearing it in the news, about the world's focus coming upon Israel and particularly upon Gaza. Now have a look at this. This was Donald Trump's plan earlier this year. It was in February. He had a plan, and that plan was opposed by Vladimir Putin. Have a listen to what he says.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it too. We'll own it.
So there we have it. Russia is opposing Trump's plans to own the Gaza Strip. I think Trump's just in a negotiation there for something else that he wants. But Britain, how's Britain going to stop this? How's Britain going to stop Russia's intervention in what's happening? Well, here's a headline from earlier, well, it wasn't earlier last month. Britain must prepare for war with Russia in the next 5 years. There's heaps of headlines in the UK press about this sort of thing. And I won't read all the detail there, but he's saying, experts are saying that war with Putin by 2030 is a realistic possibility. And the government are not prepared. They're not prepared at all. That's exactly what we'd expect from Ezekiel 38, where Britain says, why do you come to take a spoil? Why are you coming to intervene? And Israel thinks they've dominated their enemies, and meanwhile, there's intervention coming from far, and Britain's not able to stop it. Incredible that we could see that. And what about Africa? Well, back in November 2020, something significant happened. And it had been happening for a few years before that, but particularly end of 2020, we saw Russian planning a naval base with Sudan, which is ancient Ethiopia, and planning a naval base with Sudan. 2023, where the Russian Navy was set to gain a stronghold in the Red Sea. They had to go through all the approval processes and clear the final hurdles to set up that naval base south of Israel in ancient Ethiopia, which is today Sudan. They're going to provide weapons to Sudan in return for a Red Sea naval base. And the Sudan leader was then to host that Russian naval base. Now, there's been changes in leadership in Sudan, which has complicated things, but we'll see that that policy has continued. 2023, Russia had a summit with African nations, 49 delegates, including 17 heads of state, where Putin promised grains and debt write-off as Russia seeks African allies. I find that fascinating, the fact that Armageddon is described as the wheat harvest, the grain harvest, and the very thing that Russia is doing to get allies in North Africa is by promising them debt write-offs on their grain, because grain is coming from Russia and its allies. Again, in 2023, Russia retains its allies despite the invasion of Ukraine. And you think, hang on, isn't the world against Russia? Well, not some of these North African countries falling over themselves to align themselves with Putin. Says he pulled a diplomatic rabbit out of his hat, offering free grain to 6 African countries. Of course, the people are starving there. Are they going to say no to that? And this year, early this year in February, it was reported that no obstacles were there for the Russian Red Sea base in Sudan. And a final deal was agreed for Russia to move its ships into that area in ancient Ethiopia, just south of Egypt, just south of Israel. The deal was signed and they were in complete agreement with Russia over establishment of the port. And what does it say in Daniel 11? It says that Russia comes up against them with many ships. Last month, there's headlines like this saying that Russia is building an African springboard for a war on the West in Libya. And they seem to use this uncertainty in Syria and they very much use this as a way of bringing military equipment and naval equipment into North Africa. And now they're going to have Libya back as Syria back as well. It says there that Russia is not it says giving Moscow a permanent Mediterranean launch pad. Russia is not overstretched in Africa, it is entrenched. And unless the West treats its activities as a central pillar of Moscow's strategy, rather than a peripheral nuisance, the problem will metasise. It's just incredible when you see Russia's moves. And this is in the last 24 hours. These headlines are from the last 24 hours. Syria wants Russia by our side in a new government. The new government says. Syria seeks Russia's backing to build a united and strong state. So not only is Russia now entrenching itself in North Africa with military and with ships, it's also going to ally with Syria. Syria want their help because it's going to help solidify their power. This is what we saw late last night on the news.
Russia and Syria plan to bolster ties and review agreements made under the previous pro-Moscow government of Bashar al-Assad. This comes amid uncertainty over the future of 2 Russian military bases located on Syria's Mediterranean coast. The Syrian foreign minister appealed for Russia's support during talks in Moscow. This is his first official visit to the country since Assad was ousted in an offensive last year.
Amazing. That's just last night. Here's another one from last night. Russia thought they might have lost Syria. Not anymore. Russia thanked Syria for protecting their bases and they offer training. It's exactly what we'd expect. And meanwhile, Iran and Russia, since Iran suffered the bombing of its nuclear facilities by the Americans, Iran and Russia are now, in the last week, conducting war drills in order to send a message to the United States. Remember, Ezekiel 38 says, "Be thou a guard unto them." And it says the naval drills send a message on cooperation between Iranian and Russian armed forces to the United States weeks after it joined Israel in attacking Iranian nuclear sites. Do you think Russia's not doing something here? Clearly they are. They're manoeuvring to set up their position exactly as we would expect. Here's some video of this happening about only 10 days ago. So just when it looked like Iran was smashed and Israel's now safe from their threat, we're seeing Russia insert themselves into that situation in the east. We're going to see the fourth beast stamp the residue. Russia warns of nuclear Armageddon last month after Trump's latest Ukraine move. And the Ukraine is an absolutely shocking place of war and destruction and terror. It's an absolutely tragic situation that's happening there in Iran. And Trump has been warned by Moscow that he's potentially pushing them towards nuclear war. You can see that despite Israel's confidence of their position of neutralising their enemies, there's this potential destruction coming from out west and from the east. And this is just last night on Ukraine.
Russia, I think it's disgusting what they're doing.
Trump's given them 10 days to make a peace deal. He likes giving them deadlines. So there we have it. And Netanyahu, the press in England is saying Netanyahu has finally lost Europe. Originally, European nations were backing Israel with their war against Hamas because European nations are facing similar threats in Europe. But now, and no doubt you've seen the latest drama in Australia even as to whether to what extent the Australian government will support potentially a Palestinian state. But it's saying there that there's now an increasingly loud European calls for an arms embargo against Israel. So this has led to France now planning to recognise Palestine. Again, this is just in the last week.
And staying with West Asia, global sentiment is shifting on the Gaza war. When it started, most people were silent. They understood the scale of Israel's pain on October 7th. So most of the world said nothing. Almost 2 years later, that is changing. The sympathy has firmly shifted from Israel to Palestine. The latest shift has come from France. President Macron has announced a major decision. Paris will recognize the state of Palestine in September. Now, just to be clear, more than 140 countries already recognize Palestine, including India, China, and Russia. But most Western governments do not. They say, let's find a two-state solution first. Then we will recognize Palestine. But that attitude is changing. Last year, 3 European countries made the move: Norway, Ireland, and Spain. All three recognized Palestine, and now France has done the same thing. Ireland.
So isn't that interesting? We're now starting to see a shift where the focus is going to be on the land of Israel, and particularly Gaza and what they're calling Palestine. Well, what do you think Putin's response to Macron is? Here it is. Of course, Putin agrees. He says, of course, we should be doing this. So the focus is going to be on the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem particularly. Because when they talk about Palestine, we're talking also about the status of Jerusalem. We can see where it's all going, can't we? So Russia's sort of saying, oh, well, we'll agree to a two-state solution. And I think that's interesting about the two-state solution and Russia's agreement to that. Russia actually, a few years ago, accepted and recognised Israel's occupation of West Jerusalem. And Zechariah 14 says half the city will go into captivity. And I believe it's because they are simply saying, well, we recognise West Jerusalem, but Israel's rejected that. We're going to take half the city into captivity because East Jerusalem is illegally occupied by Israel. I think that's why those words are there in Zechariah 14. And so, brothers and sisters, I suppose we finish with some contemplation on what we are seeing. Do you think the things happening in our world are enough to make up our heads for our redemption draws nigh? We see that's the foreign editor of The Australian there making that comment. He's saying, is the Middle East finally on the brink of Armageddon? It's just staring us in the face, isn't it? He says that one miscalculation could result in a devastating conflict. And brothers and sisters, the wonderful thing is that this is going to lead to Israel's salvation and Jerusalem to be restored to God's favour. The Lord Yahweh roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall quake. But Yahweh is a refuge to his people, a stronghold to the people of Israel. So shall you know that I am Yahweh your God, who dwells in Zion, my holy mountain. Then Jerusalem will be holy. And brothers and sisters, we long for the time, don't we, when God will wipe away all tears from our eyes, and there will be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither there will be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And so let us lift up our heads, for our redemption draws nigh. We can see it clearly, can't we? And let us help each other towards that glorious kingdom. Thanks.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.